So let's get started. My name is Dan Beck. I'm the director of LGRMS. If you're not familiar, LGRMS provides risk control services for ACCGs and GMAs, workers' compensation, property and liability, and health insurance pools. If you might remember, last year we had a freeze and we lost, because of that freeze, we lost several $1,000,000 in property losses. What happened was, I think it was during an extended weekend, pipes froze. We did not have anybody attending those pipes. They thawed, and then there was water damage, again, that resulted in millions of dollars of losses. So because of that, we're looking for a solution, and one of the solutions we came up with, Adam Care is going to talk to you about. So Adam, take it away.
Great, thank you, Dan, and hi, everyone. Appreciate you having me today. I think as Dan shared, please feel free if you want to come off mute, if you want to chat in the questions or the chat function. Would love to engage at the time you have a question or a comment to share, but look forward to talking today about how HSB is helping and enabling our insurance partners, and a big part of that, our public entity pooling partners, ultimately allow members to mitigate water and freeze losses primarily. So we'll walk you through some content today about how we're doing that. And the first slide, and maybe the only one just about HSB, if you don't know, Hartford steam boiler based in Hartford, Connecticut. I'm actually out of Austin, Texas myself. And so I'm not unfamiliar, unfortunately, with freezing events in parts of the country that don't necessarily not always freeze. We've had 2 winters in a row of some frozen temperatures, and the first one here in Texas. There was also that power grid failure situation for a number of days that went alongside of it. But HSB, about 160 years as an organization, primarily, if you know the name, known for, I believe, our commercial equipment breakdown product line, but about 10 years ago got into the IoT space as well. And I think somewhat interesting, why did we do that? And we really did it to help support our existing reinsurance partners. But for us, it's really a combination of a lot of approaches to the market that I think that we've been trying to bring for a lot of years, and primarily how we bring engineering capabilities, how we use technology, and try to innovate. And so a combination of those elements allowed us to have today our sensor solution product, but again, really primarily designed to help mitigate property-related perils. And why I think that's interesting is HSB as a company doesn't write property, we write equipment. So this is really something to the benefit of our partners that we've been trying to do, and have a lot of success, I think, in the public entity pooling space in particular at that. And so this is a value proposition page, but why IoT or why sensors for the insurance space? The top left quadrant here, to mitigate losses, is why we're doing it. If you're not able to ultimately stop water events from becoming larger issues, or potentially predict and prevent freeze-related losses, and have ultimately the frequencies of those events drop, you're not successful. And so first and foremost, trying to mitigate water and freeze losses is the largest part about what we do. We think somewhat uniquely, though, there's an added benefit to partnerships, specifically in the insurance realm where we operate, but IoT, hopefully from a pooling perspective, it enables to offer something different compared to what the most of the market can. You potentially could be sharper ultimately as an underwriting company with the data that comes from it, but also it's another interaction point. Instead of being involved from a dynamic subsequent to a claim, if you can help ultimately a member stop an event, stop a claim event from happening, it's probably the best interaction that ultimately can be provided. And so some of the numbers about where we're playing, we've been out with the current generation of technology from about early 2018, coming up on 9 years in the broader IoT space for us. And so that amounts to about 50 different, what we call carrier partners, but a number of them, a very good number of them, are actually public entity pooling partners as well, where we have our IoT sensor solutions deployed at targeted membership basis. There's about 20 or so larger occupancies we actively play in. But as we'll see here on some of the following slides, 3 of the most prominent ones are in the public entity realm: school districts, municipalities, counties, villages, mud districts, and ultimately religious institutions. Because I think, Dan, as you stated earlier on the example of the past freeze event in Georgia, is that those 3 occupancies in particular have a lot of underlying similarities, arguably aging infrastructure, facility staff, having to keep talent, having to replace very experienced hands that are retiring, but I think somewhat uniquely also periods of time on the weekends or over holidays where people simply aren't in the buildings, where a small issue can become a much larger related event. And so there's a lot of similarities of why we play in certain occupancies. And so from a numbers perspective, I think the last big one here, but what we did was going back to the latest time, or the earliest time we have the current generation of technology out in the field. We'll talk about it here on the following slides, what that is, but it's our low-Ra WAN technology. In 2018 was our first deployments of this generation of technology. So 2018 deployments to April this year, when we ran the numbers, we looked at our largest scale clients. So those carriers or those public entity pools that have the most sensor deployments out among our partnership. And we looked at what was their average return on investment. And that number was over 600%. And so how we back into this number, really goes back to that top quadrant, ultimately in the value proposition slide, which is we're trying to ultimately mitigate losses. From a water perspective, you're really able to do that, not necessarily by trying to mitigate the frequency or how many water events happen, because by the time you have a sensor that alerts to the presence of water in an area that it shouldn't be, you already have some incident on question. What you're trying to do is ultimately tamp down on the severity. So how big that loss becomes. From a freeze perspective, you're in this very interesting predictive and preventative standpoint, where if you can watch those internal temperatures of a building drop, and you can be able to alert someone prior to a frozen pipe scenario, you could stop that event from happening altogether. And so when we look at those 2 major loss drivers of water and freeze, how we back into a return on investment from our partners is we look at a location confirmation from a member that an alert went off that ultimately drove someone to take action that they otherwise weren't aware of. And that action would have had a loss event relative to it. And then we ask, traditionally our pooling partners, what is your average water loss? What is your average freeze loss? And we use that value to assign potentially a save-related event, but nothing goes into the return on investment or save column outside of location-generated confirmation that an alert did lead someone to a loss scenario they were able to prevent or otherwise mitigate. And so while the overall book return on investment for our largest partners in terms of the largest number of sensors deployed is over 600%, the reality is when you look at school districts and you look at municipalities, including counties, that number is actually higher. And I think that's a big testament, again, to the fact that you've got buildings and you've got breaks periods or vacation periods that you don't have people in the buildings all the time. And those situations can go unnoticed for evenings or a couple times days or weeks to become larger related scenarios. So I'm going to pivot here and start talking about some of the sensors and the hardware and the software that goes into the solution. But I'll take a quick break here to see if any questions so far on what I've discussed, and happy to address them if there are.
No questions at this point in time that I see.
All right, perfect. So current generation of technology, and something we announced earlier this year, we're on the 3rd generation of our low-Ra WAN technology. And so ultimately, low-Ra WAN is a networking protocol that allows the sensors themselves to connect to the gateway. And so the sensors themselves are battery powered, and they ultimately operate via this networking protocol. Long range, low power, wide area network is the networking protocol. So the sensors themselves connect to the cellular gateway via this networking protocol, low route WAN. And then ultimately the information coming off the sensor goes straight to a cell tower, and ultimately is then goes up into the cloud where all our proprietary algorithms happen and take those X's and O's coming off the sensors. So what you get ultimately are battery powered sensors, and therefore sensors that you can place in areas of a building that otherwise would not be able to communicate cellularly. So the idea of you taking $1,000+ iPhone into the basement of a cinder block building and being able to make or receive a phone call is very unrealistic in most cases. And so you're able to actually put a sensor in an area of a building that couldn't be able to communicate, but as long as the gateway itself can connect to the sensor, and then the gateway is going to connect to a cell tower, you can have penetrative capabilities ultimately throughout the building. So the core of the technology is really predicated on water sensors, and the water sensors themselves ultimately have two different probes on the bottom of the sensors, and that goes onto the ground. And you ultimately place sensors. We'll talk about where within general county and municipal exposures we think are the highest exposed areas for water monitoring, but they go in areas you don't expect water to be. So when water comes into there, you know that something's going on that you need to address. So the sensors are designed to sit 1/16 inch off the ground. They're battery powered. They're not single hit. You can dry them off, put them back down. We'll go over a safe scenario later in the municipal space where we had back-to-back saves on separate days, or about 5 days after one another, the same sensor ultimately in a senior living facility that produced 2 big saves for one of our muni partners. But the water sensors go on the ground, and ultimately they communicate when water or a liquid comes into contact with that sensor for a duration of time. And it goes to a location level contact at that facility to let them know that this sensor in this part of the building is going off, and you need to get out there and try to address that situation. Similarly, from a water sensor, we have a temperature humidity sensor that ultimately is able to mitigate or detect for frozen pipe scenarios. And so that temperature humidity sensor goes up on the wall and ultimately is trying to monitor for the ambient temperature of a building. And so what we're trying to detect there is dropping temperatures that could ultimately lead to frozen pipe related scenarios. And just 1 second here. So ultimately we're putting them up on an ambient temperature sensor perspective. And what we're trying to do is detect maybe there was a power outage situation that ultimately caused the temperature, or ultimately caused the heating temperature to not work. Or maybe we had a related scenario where there was an issue with the HVAC and damper system. And so we're trying to be able to alert people to the fact that something's going on at that location. And ultimately, if you aren't able to take some underlying situation, try to be able to, if you aren't able to take some action, you're going to likely have a frozen pipe related scenario. And so we really deploy in a combination of water and temperature sensors for it to ultimately try to, again, detect presence of water or freezing temperature. And then beyond those two sensor technologies, we do have other devices that ultimately operate in small commercial buildings. We've got a device that has the ability to detect for water or temperature ultimately within an environment. We really use that in small commercial or personal lines. And we uniquely have a water shutoff device that we've just introduced to the marketplace. And so we'll tell you about that in a quick second. And Dan, I'm gonna take 10 seconds here. I've got, unfortunately, my daughter screaming who's homesick, and I'll be right back. I apologize. I'll be very. Sorry about that. So ultimately, we have a water shutoff device, and we're always interested in use cases about how this can ultimately apply. And so the basis of our current deployments have been predicated on how a shutoff device or how a monitoring device can alert someone in a property that something is going on and allow them the best action to be able to take some mitigative situation. But we haven't had that action related component. And so now we do have a shutoff device that is designed to go on a water line from 1/2 inch up to 2 inches that would ultimately allow someone at that location, when you get a water alert, to be able to turn off a water line. And so essentially what you're allowing yourself to do is buy more time to get on site and to try to figure out what that ongoing situation is. Where we're not playing, it's not designed as whole building water shutoff. There are some solutions out on the marketplace. They're also very expensive on how they play. And so, but we think there's a lot of deployment in public entity, in county and municipal buildings that you're not trying to shut off a giant high-rise office story. Again, it's really just, it's designed to sit over a ball valve and turn that ball valve, and you can actually trigger that remotely as well. And so it's something that is just coming out to the marketplace for us here in about the next 30 days as well. But we think that there could be great ultimate application within the public entity realm for us. And so beyond the hardware, everything else operates from a software perspective. And so ultimately, any individual location contacts at a facility, they have an application on their phone where they're able to see information coming off the sensors 24/7. And so from a temperature and humidity perspective, you can log in, see those sensors, where they're located, respond to ultimately all the triggering algorithms, the alerts that come within the app, or you could be passive. And so we'll talk about how the alerts work, that even if you're not paying attention to the sensors, there's an outreach program to location level contacts that ultimately alert them when they need to be taking action, specifically when there's urgent level alerts. And so one of the examples of that, the digital alert acknowledgement, is at the highest level of alert, which is an urgent alert for anything related to water or any imminent freeze related loss event. Ultimately, all those location contacts at an individual location would get an alert, and it would ultimately allow them to respond. Either I'm in a position to take action and I will, ignore it, I'm on site, maybe I was mopping the floors or I spilled water on a sensor, it's not a related event, or I'm not in a position to take action. And so a lot of times, unfortunately, situations when they happen, they don't happen at 3 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, they happen at 2 a.m. on a Sunday. And so anyone who's assigned to that location would be able to see anyone else's responses. In the event ultimately that there was no response within a 10-minute period, we're going to place an outgoing phone call to the primary contact at that location to, again, give them the best opportunity to take some sort of mitigative action of whatever's going on in that property. And we've got an insights dashboard that ultimately operates primarily at a pooling level basis or a carrier level basis, but that really operates where all the individual information of the sensors, where they're deployed, their connectivity, the alert events, and then ultimately the aggregation of saves we put together to be able to aggregate that information up traditionally to the risk-bearing partner as well. Any questions before I jump into some of the specific technologies and perils and how the sensors are working?
Here's a question. Is there a cost to the device?
There is a cost to the device from the HSB perspective. Ultimately, how we operate, we call it a subscription or equipment as a service basis, where technically HSB retains ownership of the equipment. They're clearly deployed within the underlying membership, but there's essentially a monthly cost for that device. But as part of that, it's the hardware, it's all the software, it's the app access, and its installation. So there is a per sensor and per gateway device cost associated with it, but with that, you ultimately get essentially the entire functioning program. Does that answer that question?
I believe so.
Okay. And any other questions for the time?
No other questions at this time.
Okay, great. So ultimately, from a peril perspective, I described a bit schematically of how the sensors ultimately connect all our commercial solutions, and in fact, all of our deployments in public entity situations are the sensors themselves ultimately connected to the gateway via that low-raw WAN protocol. From the big perils, the two here on the bottom left are really, I think, why we play where we do. Freeze loss is always the concern, but it's also very seasonal. That outside of certain parts of the country, you may have a 2 or 3 month period where freeze losses are a concern. Your normal attritional water loss, whether it's a pipe burst on the inside, traditionally that would be due to freeze, but whether it's a hot water heater that lets go, an overrunning toilet, something else in the equipment room, those water leaks or attritional water leaks happen throughout the years. And so I think we look at freeze and we absolutely deploy with a consciousness, but even outside of a winter season, I think that the saves for our partners are really rolling in throughout the year. Beyond that water leak detection and frozen pipe detection, the temperature humidity sensors oftentimes wear a number of different hats. And so one of the things that those sensors do is they can detect high temperature. And so there's a set threshold at a temperature point above 100 degrees that they would alert, essentially let somebody know there's something going on here, unless otherwise it's in a building in the middle of summer in Georgia and there's no HVAC system. That building should never get up to that temperature. There also has an ability to play in the mold condition awareness. We're not measuring for mold spores, but what we are measuring for is high temperature, high humidity over duration of time. And so those are conditions that would be ripe for mold growth. And so what we're doing is we're sending an informational alert and just giving someone the idea that these conditions are not ideal. You should probably get out to that site to figure out, again, if you thought otherwise you'd had a properly functioning HVAC system, that it's not working for you right now in that area. Maybe a damper's not working, maybe the HVAC system's not on, but a good clue to come check out the situation. We've had some success on that. We have an event that happened about 2 years ago, ultimately at a school, where we had a mold condition alert go off that allowed the buildings and ground staff to go out on site to that temperature humidity sensor. What they were actually able to determine was the high temperature, or excuse me, the high humidity of the room and the temperature. There was a leak behind drywall, a pinhole leak of a water pipe that was causing that to go off. And so maybe a fluke situation, but otherwise a mold alert that drove someone to find an undiscovered water leak behind the wall at that point. And then the last hat that temperature humidity sensor wears, and this is definitely very dependent upon the specific municipal and county occupancy, but the ability to monitor walk-in freezers and refrigerators for refrigeration failure is another part that we find a lot of success in the public entity realm, and it doesn't get the same degree of savings on a ledger perspective as a water and freeze loss do, typically based on the severity of those types of claims, but it definitely helps entities keep going. And so ultimately, that same temperature humidity sensor that could go up on the wall and normally monitor for what is ambient room temperatures for freeze goes inside those walk-in freezers and refrigerators, and it monitors for deviance of hold temperature. And so as those temperatures rise above what the normal temperature is, it sends an alert out saying that something's going wrong. It could be your compressor's failing. It could be that someone's left the door open for lunch preparation if it's a school setting, but ultimately gives them that opportunity to the best extent to potentially move those food goods before there's a true spoilage related event. We see other actors in the higher education and municipal or county space do the same thing for potential vaccination storage or inside healthcare clinics to monitor some of those refrigeration units as well. And so the next couple of slides here, I've got some schematics of different commercial buildings. The first one's an example of cut out of a school district. The second one is a more residential perspective, and then show you how it comes together on a campus type dynamic. So ultimately within a school district, there's a number of different areas, and this could apply to a lot of commercial buildings that we think sensors should be deployed at. First and foremost, we think boiler, utility, electrical rooms are high area of high coverage equipment, but also equipment that's sometimes very susceptible to water, or in the case of hot water heaters, ultimately may let go after a general life expectancy. And so those are always areas that we would recommend deployment of water sensors, and also temperature humidity sensors. We get a lot of frozen pipe related scenarios ultimately in boiler or equipment rooms within given facilities. Other areas that we think are great, and these are sometimes based on the underlying demographics, would be an area of a building. One second, I'm sorry. Would be an area of a building that potentially would be subject to external water that would come into a building during heavy rainfall. And so the example here, if you've got a lower entrance level and you know during rains that sometimes water comes in, if you were able to put a water sensor ultimately at that lower egress, you may be able to have someone be able to come out in the event of a heavy rainstorm, or maybe what we found sometimes a blocked up drain down there or clogged up drain that ultimately didn't allow that water to go somewhere else. Areas of a building like toilets, like bathrooms, that you have running water conditions, definitely areas that we look at deployment. And so somewhat similarly for different settings, and again, I think a larger larger gamut of what the occupancies are, but similarly different areas within a building. If it's potentially more residential in nature, you've got a different setup for where some of those hot water heaters are. You may have laundry facilities. You definitely have more kitchen type facilities. So all different areas that we think ultimately would be good areas to be able to monitor for water related scenarios. And again, similarly for frozen pipe dynamics. And I think somewhat uniquely when you get into the county space too becomes cluster of buildings. And so for us, for a cluster of building or a campus, we see this in a lot of different demographics. I think county and municipal buildings are part of that, but we know larger school campuses, higher education also see this. And this is the ability essentially to strategically deploy gateways in a pretty tight-knit area. The rule of thumb generally is one gateway per building. It provides a base level of coverage and penetration from that networking protocol. But we definitely have buildings, and some large ones in particular, that may need more gateways. What we can do in a campus type setting is ultimately look at how those buildings, how close they are, and maybe provide coverage for more than one building with an individual gateway. And so some of the elements of what we do from a custom type deployment of how we try to provide coverage, ideally with the least amount of equipment, but the greatest upside to potentially help. And so where within ultimately a building, this is one of our county and more municipal related installation guides that we would bring out from an installation basis. These are the areas within a building that we think are most susceptible for water and potentially freeze related scenarios. So clearly top of mind here, boiler, mechanical, networking rooms are always areas that we look to target. Networking rooms a little interesting because you've got potentially high dollar computer equipment. You don't want it to get wet, but you also want to be conscious of what the heat and humidity in there as well. And so there's some interesting type monitoring we're looking at about specifically networking or server rooms. Fire sprinkler rooms, a great place from ultimately a control perspective from a temperature humidity basis. The availability of kitchen pantry rooms, not only is there running water because of sink perspective, maybe there's some dishwashing equipment in there as well, but another area you can also have the uniqueness relative to the refrigerators and the freezers that ultimately sit there. And then how it all comes together, ultimately from a deployment basis, What we try to do is put together kits really based on specific occupancies, and within those occupancies, really separated by square footage. And so every state is different in terms of how the schools are situated. And so in fairness, within Georgia, the schools may not fall to the counties or the local governments from oversight perspective. In some states they do. But ultimately what we look to do is go build kits that are appropriate for the occupancies with a general guidance perspective. And so gateways typically operate, again, one gateway per building. If you're in a campus type setting, you could strategically deploy them. But from a sensor perspective, we want to get enough water sensors out there in the prime areas of exposure, temperature, humidity sensors to be able to give you those ambient temperature monitoring capabilities. And then we've got a plug-in device accessory to the sensors that ultimately can also act as pipe-free sensors. And so the way that works is both the temperature humidity sensors as well as the water sensors have essentially an audio jack. And we've got a plug-in ultimately temperature sensor that goes on the end of it that can then attach to an exposed water pipe, normally a sprinkler pipe. So instead of just being able to monitor the ambient temperatures within a room, ultimately you may have an area of a building, for instance, that you've got a sprinkler line that for some reason runs above the drop ceiling. And so normally your heat can't get to it. Even if the building is well heated, you know that space typically gets colder than other areas of the building. And so you would arguably be able to put a temperature humidity sensor up there, ultimately with a pipe sensor that's attached to it to be able to tell the temperature of the exposed metal pipe, but really through that, what the temperature of the water flowing through that pipe is. And so areas that facilities know have had prior issues are great kind of insights that we look to from an installation perspective, that what does the buildings and grounds, facility staff, janitorial staff know about those buildings uniquely that we wouldn't, and look to go target some of those specific deployed locations. And so I think last slide or two here from an overview perspective, this is a snapshot ultimately of the application I talked about. This is a iPhone and Android app, the Protect app, that would allow anyone who's assigned as the location level contact to see the buildings or all of the county government they were responsible for, all the deployments within that area. And you can pull up and see the specifics of the sensors. You can see what is the battery power of the sensor. You can respond to alerts. You can check the connectivity to the gateway. You can check that the gateway is still ultimately connected to the cell tower. But basically, you've got that 24/7 viewpoint into a facility, at least from a water detection standpoint and a temperature standpoint, than you otherwise had. I think one of the interesting dynamics with this LoRaWAN gateway is the gateway itself, though, the power outage notification. And so within the given app, even though you'll ultimately get a text message and a push notification or email, one of those information level alerts is the power outage alert. And so in the event that there is a power outage, or ultimately what is a trip breaker within the section of electrical panel that gateway is plugged into, when there's that power outage situation, the gateway itself sends an alert to location contacts to notify that it's going to a battery backup perspective. And there's about a 4-hour battery backup perspective in that gateway. When line power is restored, it sends an informational alert to let you know that line power has come on. So there's even an ability to know without being at the building if there's power still at the building. And more importantly, I think for people responsible for those locations, what equipment do you need to rely on that is not going to be operating without power? So there's another queue up on nights and on weekends if a power is ultimately, or a building has ultimately lost power. And you can see those notifications come from ultimately inside the app, as well as, I clicked through the wrong way, as well as ultimately text message, push notification, and then in the event of those urgent level alerts, as I said before, water, imminent freeze, or an imminent spoilage related event, that is also the outgoing phone call, potentially to someone being passive that hasn't seen it or is sleeping in the middle of the night, to let them know that something's going on at the property that they need to be aware of. And so this slide here is ultimately the description of the different type of alerts that are coming off of it. Top level informational alerts just come via text message, come via email. There isn't necessarily immediate action tied to these, although it is a great cue relative to that gateway power outage scenario of knowing when power comes on or comes off. It's also tracked inside of the app. The warning alerts I almost consider to be threshold level alerts. And so ultimately those are alerts that something is going on from a temperature perspective. You don't have an urgent loss situation, but something's not trending in the right direction. And so that could be the example of a building in the middle of winter that normally holds at 65 or 60 degrees that's now sitting at 40 degrees. Something is not right with that building. Early warning before you get ultimately an urgent alert when temperatures are sitting, closer in the mid to low 30s, that you may have a frozen pipe scenario ultimately if you don't take action. And so the last slide is this is schematically how we try to take all this information and roll it up. The individual information at deployed locations, the alerts, the ROIs, but ultimately the save events, it comes in, tracks in an aggregated program management view perspective for us. And I'll take another pause here. The next number of slides I have are just specific save examples, all from our public entity deployments about how those sensors have been deployed and ultimately what some mitigative ultimate examples are at those locations. So anything, Dan, coming in on chat, or anyone from an attendee you'd like to ask?
Your questions they have, Adam. Is there a way to schedule a consultation for assessment?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll read into what a consultation is, but I think ability to talk more about how things work and how it would be applicable, I do think that we'd be able to do that. Is that your sense of what that question was, Dan?
Yeah, I think they just want to, see what it's going to run them. So you could probably do a lot of that over the phone, right?
Yeah, I think we would have a conversation over the phone. We primarily operate through a pool-wide engagement, but I think, Dan, we can have a follow-up conversation and see what the interest is.
So what's the best way for them to, if they're interested in that, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you or to schedule something like that?
Yeah, I think you could share my contact information, my email, or my phone number, and we could determine what, ultimately what the need is and what they're looking for, and if we're able to help.
So just to let everybody know, I'll be sending out the recording along with the PDF of the presentation and Adam's contact information if you're interested in an assessment. Next question, can you set up a temp sensor?
Can you set up a temp sensor? So maybe I'll address this from two sides and maybe hit both of what I think my intent is. So the actual setup dynamic, the entire system is really predicated on a do-it-yourself installation method. And what we moved to a number of years ago was HSB would come out and actually do the installation of the equipment. Primarily because we had scenarios where pools or carrier partners had chosen insured locations. We sent the boxes of equipment out to those contacts and they never got open. And so us going out and physically doing the installation is normally the basis of how we operate today. But technically, there's a step-by-step process in the app about how you connect everything. And so so it technically is able to be done on a do-it-yourself location level basis should that desirability be there. If the question was, can you set temperature thresholds or unique temperature thresholds? within the temperature app from an alert perspective? The answer to that is no, that there is a triggering algorithm for ambient freeze temperatures, and then there's those algorithms for refrigeration monitoring and high temperature monitoring, but those are not configurable ultimately at an individual location level. Those are part of our algorithms. And so maybe both sides of that hopefully answered that question. And if not, I'd happy to take another stab if you want to ask a different angle that I couldn't think about there.
I think that was the angle. They said thanks. So,
okay.
Anybody else have any questions or comments? I can sense, Adam, that they're all standing at their desks applauding at this point in time. So it's nice to get a standing ovation on a webinar. With that said, I don't think we probably have any more questions. But thank you so very much for participating. I think this is an excellent solution. That's the premise behind sharing this. So as I said before, I'll be sharing Adam's contact information if you're interested. Adam, any final words of wisdom for everyone?
No, I think as you get a copy of the deck here, there's a handful of more slides, but they're just stories on specific SAVE examples in our county and municipal and public entity deployments. And so some live examples for how the sensors ultimately helped partners mitigate losses. And the last few slides here ultimately is a picture of the sensors in more detail about the current generation of technology we have. So appreciate the opportunity to talk today, and thank you, Dan, and for ultimately your members as well.
Again, thank you, Adam. Thank you, everybody that joined. Please, if you have any questions, let me know, but I'll be sending something out later this week. Thank you all. Have a great rest of the day.